Let's get started. Everyone, welcome to this first webinar in our Green Shoot series. This is a series that we organize under the Wild E project. We're very excited to have you all here today and looking forward to do this first session. And in this webinar, we will be highlighting the diversity of research that we do as part of Wild E on rewilding and also all of the young talent that we have as part of this project. So what is Wild E? It's a project funded by the European Union where we're looking at rewilding as climate smart solution to both the biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis we are in today. In this project, we will look at climate smart rewilding at 8 different sites across Europe and looking how rewilding is practiced there and which lessons can we learn also in the general things. And in this project, we have a great team of researchers all over Europe with over 15 young researchers, PhDs, postdocs. So we are quite excited to be able to show all the different things we are working on during the coming 3 years to you in this webinar series. And we try to highlight also a lot of the young talent that we have here in our team. We will host these webinar series every 3 to 4 months. So if you like today, please join also the next ones that will coming up in the winter. With that, I would also like to announce the speakers we have today, which is very exciting. We have Nacho Villar and Liesbeth Bakker from the Netherlands Institute for Ecology. And today, Nacho and Liesbeth will talk to us about how large wildlife can actually help us to fight against climate change and assist with climate change adaptation, with lots of examples from all over the world. So do stay tuned. After the presentation, we have a lot of room for questions and interactions. So any questions you might have, please put them in the chat and we will address them during the Q&A after the presentation. Do note that this webinar is recorded and that there is an opportunity to rewatch it later, most likely on YouTube if you want it. To start off, Liesbeth will give a bit of an introduction on the entire topic. So Liesbeth, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and good morning, everybody who's online today. And we're also really excited to have this first seminar in a series. Well, I can immediately say I'm Liesbeth Bakker, senior researcher at the Netherlands Institute of Ecology and professor of Rewilding Ecology at Wageningen University. But I do not qualify as a young researcher anymore. So Nacho will be giving a presentation here. He's working at the Netherlands Institute of Ecology on the Wild E project with me. And he's coordinating the rewilding practice in all the 8 case studies throughout Europe. And he's also leading the case study in the Netherlands of Millinga-Waardgelde support. And we're really excited to start with that as well. So the topic of today is about large wildlife. Well, thinking of rewilding, many people already automatically start thinking of large wildlife in the first place. For a long time, this has been in relation to a wildlife comeback, for instance, when you see large animals returning in the landscape in many places on the globe. But then second step would be how this large wildlife may affect ecosystems in terms of particularly biodiversity. But now I would say we're moving to the next frontier, if you can say it like that, to see how large wildlife plays a role and can potentially have a positive contribution to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this is a very fast developing field. Yeah, exciting topic. And it's a great pleasure to have Nacho introducing all of us to what this actually is about. So please, Nacho, take the floor.
Oh, well, thank you very much for this very nice introduction, Liesbeth and team, and all the team in OPLA as well. Yes, I have the honor to introduce the seminar series, so thank you very much. Yeah, this is a very lightning subject, I would say, and something that goes to the hearts of many ecologists. And so I will try to navigate through it lightly but giving some illustrative examples of how large wildlife can contribute to climate change, to fight against climate change. Yeah. Okay, so let's get started by realizing that yeah, I haven't checked the news today, but basically when you wake up these days in the morning, you see some disturbing event. related to climate change directly or indirectly. Yeah, and it's very sad to see this, and it breaks the heart of many people, and it has tremendous consequences on the livelihoods of people and on the road that we have ahead. I would say that there are very worrying processes going on out there that really validate the fact that climate change is not something that is coming, it's something that is already here. We are already burning the Arctic. We've been burning it for the last decade at least. This is just to show, the hotspots of in Russia in 2019, for example. Yeah, and there's lots of wildfires all over the Arctic. But we also melted the Arctic. Yeah, so there's the land, the soil in the Arctic is getting increasingly warm, and that also causes the snow to melt. And that this rate of melting is just something astonishing. Yeah, so the rate of change is something a decrease of 13% per decade. So we're getting rid of ice in the Arctic. And the same in Antarctic. I mean, last year the Antarctic had 1 million square kilometers below the previous record low. So we're melting the poles basically. And then this summer we'll have to cope with the hottest summer in history. And we all know, wherever you are in the world, probably you have experienced one event of some kind linked to the hottest summer in history. So we are feeling climate change because climate change is here and is here to stay. And sometimes I find myself reflecting on, having a really pessimistic reflections about, how close we are of this sort of post-apocalyptic world. But we, as a scientist, I also think that we have to be positive and think about solutions for that not to happen. Yeah. So today, as Liesbeth and Tim said, I'm gonna do a walkabout around some illustrative examples of how can wildlife help us with climate change. And the first thing is that for wildlife, it's not good days either. In the last 4 decades, has been declining wildlife has been declining globally at very steep rate, and that changes by region. And as Liesbeth said, there are also comebacks, right? So in Europe, wildlife is starting to come back at unprecedented rates as well. That is obviously not the case in other parts of the planet, yeah. But even if wildlife is coming back, some studies have shown that there is the biomass of wildlife that we found in present ecosystems doesn't match the amount of productivity and biomass of living matter that they have to feed on out there. So basically, we have much less biomass of wildlife that is possible to have in this world, if you want. Even if the perception is that we have too many, the perception is that we have too many because we come from a defaunated world, a world in which large wildlife has been wiped out from many parts of the planet. And if we look at the share of wild mammals, for example, in the biomass of the world, well, it's just 4%. I mean, 60% of the world biomass has been appropriated by our cattle and our sheep and our horses and our so the livestock that we have. And the question is whether that 4% could make a difference. Yeah. And actually, if we increase it to 10, 15, 20%, will it help us to fight against climate change? And there are a number of studies globally that show that actually this is the case. Okay. And this is a list of possible processes and different systems in which climate in which large wildlife can help us to fight climate change. And there are examples of different processes through carbon storage or soil trace emission, or helping with albedo if you want, or capturing carbon in the soil, or many other processes that are going to show and that in different ecosystems wildlife can help us to fight against climate change. So I'm going to start with the most intuitive of the processes, which is seed dispersal. So basically, maybe some of the audience doesn't know that most large animals in tropical forests eat fruits, because there are lots of fruits out there. So they don't actually eat so much leaves or shoots of trees and of plants. They actually eat a lot of fruits. And many trees out there in the tropical forest, they are dispersed by animals. They have evolved to disperse to actually move their seeds across the landscape through animals. Okay, and actually many people wouldn't know that even terrestrial mammals, like ground-dwelling mammals like tapirs and peccaries and brocket deer, bacca and cutia, and many others eat, even many mesopredators eat a lot of fruits. So the thing is that the larger the herbivore, the larger the frugivore, the animal that eats fruits, the larger the fruits. So large animals in tropical forest eat large fruits. And large fruits come from trees that store a lot of carbon, big trees, species that have big amount of carbon stored in their bark and in their physiognomy. So basically, if you this has been studied through many reviews, but this prominent work by Carolina, friend of mine, in the topics, so that actually the largest frugivores store facilitate the dispersal of fruits that will develop into very large trees which capture a lot of carbon. Then, so imagine that you come out from this initial community which stores a lot of carbon in the trees, and there has a lot of large animals, and you defaunate, you get rid of these animals by a number of processes like hunting or like habitat destruction, etc. Basically, you end up in a low carbon scenario because there's nobody to carry the fruits anymore. Okay, so therefore there's no more development of large trees. And if you can do some simulations and show that this affects carbon storage in tropical forests and affects in a substantial amount. Then obviously this changes across the world. So there are parts of the world, continents, like in Southeast Asia, where there are less frugivores, less animals that eat fruits. And so in different regions of the world, you have different potentials to capture carbon above ground in the trees through the indirect effect of large frugivores. Okay. So, and this is actually being used as a, is initiating initiatives to reintroduce large frugivores to disperse large seeds and to recover the carbon in the system. Right. So let's move to another continent. Let's move to Africa, for example. And in Africa, recent studies have found that forest elephants also increase carbon at intermediate densities, and they do it through different pathways. One of them is, as I previously showed, that dispersing large seeded trees. Elephants in tropical forests, the forest elephant also eats large fruits that develop into large trees, if you want. But they also feed on tasty leaves that usually come from low carbon trees. So the trees that are left over, if you want, are contain a high amount of carbon. And they also trample the soil. They break the trees, small trees, saplings, just by walking around and breaking the saplings. Yeah. So they also the strongest trees, which usually the strongest saplings, which usually accumulate uh, more carbon and have the potential to accumulate more carbon, are the ones which survive. So these are different pathways actually. And if you go to a forest with elephants, you can see that the large trees are more common. The orange bar here, the tallest is the largest amount of large trees, if you want. And you can see that large trees are more common in places where elephant density is intermediate, when we have intermediate elephant density. And yeah, you can show it in a different way, but it's the same message. And so you can put a value on a, if you want, if you could do that, yeah, in carbon terms. And so an elephant forest is worth 1.75 million approximately of dollars, yeah, according to this work. And then we go to the cousins of these forest elephants, the savanna elephants, which is a different species which lives in a different ecosystem. Okay, and studies have shown that savanna elephants actually still above carbon, yeah, by eating on leaves and shoots from the in the savannas. But then they store it below ground. Okay, and this study, for example, in the African savannas, with experimental study in which they isolated different kinds of large animals from in the savanna, and they looked at their effects. So this is, for example, this is the carbon pool in two different habitats if you don't have any large herbivore there, okay, in the savanna. This is when you include large herbivores of medium size, as a zebra, and something similar, impalas, for example. And then you see that if you include the large wild herbivores, you don't have much of a change in the carbon pool in the soil. If you include cattle, domestic cattle, then actually you have a decrease of carbon in the soil, no matter if you have a combination with large. But if you include savanna elephants or rhinos or something of that size, you actually increase the carbon compared to the no large animal baseline, if you want. So they're increasing carbon, soil carbon. And then we can move to the another kind of grasslands, for example. And then, yeah, in this global study from the super nice study from the Nutrient Network, which is a global research cooperative. And they also have these experiments where they exclude animals and they add nutrients to the soil, to the plants. And so they explore the impact of this combined effect of having large herbivores and having nutrients, additional nutrients in the system, and the combination of it. And what they shown that in one grasslands, the effect of large herbivores is actually positive on soil carbon and nitrogen. And then you have a gradient towards the cold grasslands where the effects seem to be more negative. Yeah. So not everything is always positive. It depends on the context. And interestingly, they show that actually if you combine large herbivores with nutrients, you have the highest gain in the soil carbon and nitrogen. Okay, so actually if you add phosphorus and nitrogen into the soil and you have herbivores feeding on that grass at the same time, you gain carbon in the soil, you store more carbon. And actually they show that this effect in nitrogen, for example, is higher in places with higher temperature variability. Okay, so you could actually speculate whether, in places like Europe where we have a huge nitrogen deposition, these large herbivores could actually contribute to, mitigate the effects of nitrogen deposition as well and reduce greenhouse gases emissions or increase soil retention. We don't know, it's a speculation, but this kind of experiments help us to elaborate hypotheses for further testing that, for important subjects like this. Okay, let's move on to the albedo effect. The albedo effect is basically the ability of the surface of the Earth to reflect sunlight, and with it, the heat that comes with it. Yeah. So the snow, for example, and the ice are very good at reflecting sunlight and reflecting that heat, if you want, with it. The water is less good, and the air is even less good. And so you can wonder how large wildlife affect albedo. That will be important for how much heat is retained in the surface of the earth. And the good news is that some studies have shown that reindeer, for example, increases snow density and the thermal diffusivity of the snow, and they decrease the snow depth. And all these factors combined, what they do is actually to decrease the, the temperature of the soil beneath the ice. Okay. Then the bad news is that this other recent study just came out fresh off the oven, from the oven, yeah, from some people across the road here in Wageningen, and it shows that if you have too many reindeer, actually, they break up the permafrost, yeah, this ecosystem, if you want, that we have in the Arctic. They break into little pieces, and what they do is they reduce, as a consequence, the amount of albedo that is reflected. So the amount of solar energy that is reflected is reduced. So if you have too many reindeer in the landscape, maybe it's not that good. Okay. Okay, so this is a job for the predators, I would say. Okay, so there's a lot of ecological theory and evidence out there showing that when you have predators, carnivores, they reduce the density of large herbivores, herbivores in general, because it's what they eat. And as a consequence, they regulate the negative impact that high densities of herbivores could have on the vegetation, therefore on the carbon stored by the vegetation. Okay, so things like the famous study of the sea otter, which actually by eating sea urchins and feeding of them allows the kelp forest to thrive and to capture more carbon. And the same happens with wolf, for example, in temperate forests. Yeah, they eat lots of large herbivores like deer, reindeer, elk, etc. And then they allow for the forest to grow and to capture more carbon. Okay, let's go quickly to adaptation, because this is something that, yeah, we see in the news that, as I said, every day they on these alarming, facts and catastrophes around the world that, take up our sleep. And what we can say is that, for example, in the case of fire, yeah, what large herbivores do for a living is actually remove fuel from the environment. Yeah, they remove biomass for a living. That's what they do, and therefore, no matter where you are, they reduce the fire frequency and the fire intensity. So this recent study shows that, wild herbivores here, represented by the wild beast here, the bar is always green. What does this green bar means? That always when you have wild herbivores, you have less frequency and less intensity of fires. Always. There's no doubt about it. Okay, what about flooding? This is, yeah, in Zaragoza in Spain, a recent episode of flooding, and yeah, this has been happening around the world. And can large herbivores and large wildlife help us with, mitigate the effects of flooding, prevent the flooding? Well, we know about this river master, yeah, the beavers. The beavers are a river master, are just the top ecosystem of the engineers of the rivers, and they prevent erosion in the rivers. They prevent droughts because they allow the water to accumulate. They regulate the water flow of the water, and at the same time, they allow to increase the diversity of the species that occur in the ecosystem where they establish. So they are, masters of generating solutions against climate change in the rivers. And yeah, there are very nice study that this recent study from took in the UK that shows that also they can mitigate diffuse pollution from intensely managed grasslands. Not only attenuate the flow of the water and increase the water storage, but also help to reduce the pollution from the grasslands around the places where they establish the homes. Yeah. And then let's move to a really recent topic, which is actually can large wildlife help us to safeguard diversity from climate change? Because climate change is also affecting diversity. So the first study actually comes from a study that we published last year. It's a long-term study in Brazil, in tropical forest, and it's an exclusion study where we were monitoring, the influence of large herbivores, large frugivores, in the case tapirs and peccaries, in the diversity of plant communities by excluding them in some plots and comparing it with plots where they were not excluded. And what we saw in the area is that there was a huge decline over more than a decade of the diversity of plant communities there, no matter if you were outside or inside or so of the plots. So whether both in the plots that were excluded and in the plots that large herbivores were allowed to roam, in both kind of plots, the diversity was declining, and that's because this place is a handbook of the Anthropocene. Basically, there's decline, there's habitat fragmentation, there's fires around the area, there's huge drought events increasingly common, so climate change and so on. And what we saw is that in the areas where large herbivores are absent, here on the right, on the brown color if you want, the decrease of diversity was more acute. It was more acute in the jewel of the crown, basically, on the spots of the forest where you have more diversity of plants, where you have more species and more more life forms there, is where the decline was more acute in the absence of herbivores. What we saw is that in the presence of large herbivores, they were buffering this decline, and they were sort of spreading the damage across all the forest, and in doing so, preserving the jewel of the crown, the hotspots of diversity. Yeah, and they were doing that actually by minimizing the compositional change. So just by preventing the communities, the plant species to arrive or to depart from the plots. Basically, they were curating the plant communities, the composition in the plant communities, and to allowing them to stay within the system. So they were slowing down the compositional change. And then there is a very similar actually outcome in this recent study in the Arctic, in which they were doing a similar experiment, but in top of excluding large herbivores and comparing exclusion with no exclusion, they were warming up the in some plots, like sort of simulating climate change, if you want. And they also show that there's also a decline of diversity over more than 2 decades in all the combinations of these, experiments, if you want. But the decline there was the least decline in the place where you have warming, but you had herbivores. So the herbivores, basically, they were helping to reduce the negative effects on warming on the diversity of the plant communities. And then they show that MOOCs oxen are increasingly in the site, increasing and because they are different species, they increase the diversity of the of the large herbivore community, if you want. And what they saw is that when you have a higher diversity community of large herbivores, you have a higher plant compositional diversity and a higher persistence of rare species. And when you have low diversity and low densities of large herbivores, you have the opposite. So it's very similar results to what we found in the tropical forest. Okay, and then just quickly gonna just ramble through a few work in progress, things that people in all, large wildlife ecology research are increasingly interested in relation to climate change mitigation and adaptation. One thing is the aquatic ecosystems. It's not there are not too many studies in aquatic ecosystems, and there are some suggestions that things like whales can, uh, have a strong impact on carbon sequestration through the different processes. But apart from this charismatic species, there's not much being done in aquatic ecosystems. So we need more studies. Another hot topic is whether surrogates of these large wild species can actually, implement their role, substitute the role and the impact of large wild herbivores that once roamed these ecosystems. So whether domestic livestock or introduced species can replicate the roles of the original large wildlife species. And there's a subject of debate, and there's a lot of research going on in this area. Another issue which we are also looking at in our Wildy project is on trophic rewilding, how to implement trophic rewilding the best way to mitigate and adapt, to help us to mitigate and adapt against to climate change. Yeah, and yeah, and then another subject is to scaling up and to understand these spatial processes, and so how large wildlife can actually distribute the impact on climate change mitigation adaptation in heterogeneous landscapes like this, yeah, in the Netherlands, and how their impacts on the structural heterogeneity in the vegetation, the forest, for example, but also in grasslands and in other places, how these affect climate change mitigation and adaptation. But also the ecology of fear. Ecology of fear basically is based on the premise that predators are scared to death to the prey, yeah? So the prey tend to, like large herbivores, tend to aggregate in places where they feel more safe. And therefore the impact on the climate change adaptation and mitigation is not the same in these landscapes where there are predators. So these are indirect effects of predators on behavior, not by eating the prey, but also by scaring to death to the prey. And then a last topic that is also upcoming and is very interesting is that the potential impacts of large wildlife on soil greenhouse emissions, yeah, things like methane and CO2 and nitrogen oxide, etc. Okay, so I'm just gonna finish by coming back to our original slides and just reflecting on the evidence out there, saying that yeah, we're pretty sure that at 4% of large mammals, large wild mammals, and other large wildlife that is out there is very important for climate change mitigation. And it would be even more if we have 10, 15, 20, 40% of the share. So large wildlife has been engineering ecosystems for millions and millions of years, and the evidence out there suggests that they can help us to climate change. So we have to help them to help us to fight against climate change. So I just pass on the word to Liesbeth, and yeah, I hope that I've sort of introduced this walkabout around the subject nicely, and I hope to have a nice chat with you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Nacho, for this overview that you gave, and yeah, many beautiful pictures and very great animals that we could see. Also, thanks to the authors of all these papers that you referred to. It's already quite an impressive amount of work that has been done on this topic, I would say. And while I was listening to you, yeah, something crossed my mind. So I think one of the questions or discussions that you easily run into when it comes to climate change mitigation, so particularly to capture more carbon, is that people seem to almost automatically wish to plant trees to meet that target. You have shown a number of examples how wildlife actually could have impacts, including positive impacts on carbon sequestration. But if you talk to foresters or so, the association with wildlife that they have is that these eat their trees, and therefore they're by definition always bad for any targets when it comes to climate change mitigation. So what would you say to them if they come up to you?
Well, it's a different and controversial question. Yeah, we know there's a lot of controversy out there. Let's say that, yeah, I mean, that's large herbivores have some negative impact on vegetation. That's what they do for a living. They eat plants. You cannot negotiate that. But then you have to think of also that they clear the land. So, for example, the elephant study is very, very inspiring. Yeah. So, you know, they clear the land from small carbon tree species, if you want. So they by feeding on the succulent species saplings, and that they have a high nitrogen content, and so they are very good for them as they're nutritious. They leave the leftovers at the plants that are less nutritious, and that's species are usually have the highest potential to store carbon. And so, for example, so that is so they reduce the density of trees in the forest, but actually they have the potential to increase the longer term carbon in the process, because they reduce competition between trees as well, because you have less you know, saplings per unit square.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can see that. So that's indeed very nice. I thought these elephant examples were really great and very inspiring. But unfortunately, I live, or at least I work in Wageningen, and when I look out of the window, I know elephants are not an option here. So in how far is that a bit species specific, or would you say there's more generality in this type of how large wildlife can have impacts?
Yeah, well, I would say that the evidence shows that yes, this is general. I mean, then the many examples across the world actually looking at how the dietary preferences, for example, of caribou, of deer, of different species of deer, of moose. I mean, in many places of the world, showing that this is the case actually, that large like ungulates in temperate systems as well. For example, they feed on these nutritious. Yeah.
Okay, I think you also said it in your presentation that there are similarities between the Greenland, Arctic, so to say, and the Brazilian Atlantic forest. So I think that's very striking to find that. I think we have some Mentimeter questions coming up soon. So I would like to give the word to Tim.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Nacho Liesbeth. We would love to hear some opinions from everyone who's listening here. If you have any other questions, do put them already in the chat so we can have them for the Q&A. But for this next session, we'll be using an online tool called Mentimeter. If you haven't used Mentimeter before, it's very easy to use, and you won't need to create an account or anything to sign in. But please go to this website that you now see on your screen, or use the QR code and enter this code. And we have some questions waiting there for you, where we would love to hear what you think about the topic we are talking about today. So if you could take this opportunity to go to this website, enter the code, or use the QR code, You don't need an account, but then we would love to hear a bit from you as well.
Can we contribute to put the wrong answer?
Of course, Nacho. So this would be the first question. This should be going up, and the moment people are putting some questions in, we should be able to see them pop up. If you still need the code and or something else, you can see at the top, the code is still present and also the website name. So do go to Menti. There we go. We see something's coming up already. So do go to menti.com and use the code at the top of the screen. I can already see, looking at the number of participants that we have here and the number of answers coming in, I think there is a sort of a clear answer coming through already. Nacho, most of the participants here seem to say that it will come at the cost of above ground biomass. Can you reflect a bit on whether this is true or whether we are just looking at the cost of a paella?
Yeah, well, first, I'm really happy it doesn't come at the cost of paella because I like a lot paella. Second, yeah, it's a tricky question actually because we were discussing about it, Liesbeth, and yeah, because obviously the in Mediterranean in other systems, yeah, as we just discussed, herbivores remove um, living matter from the vegetation, yeah. So in doing so, they remove the fuel load, if you want, of the forest, for example, and rangelands as well. So the combustible that the fire could burn. So they prevent fires. But you know, you can think as well that if you wouldn't have that fuel load, that above ground carbon removed by them, it will burn anyway. So you know, so if you didn't have any large herbivores out there to potentially, you know, store more above ground carbon, you're gonna end up having a fire sooner or later. So this is gonna be a loss in the long term. So yeah, it's a tricky question, but I mean, the audience got it right. we made it on purpose.
Jeremy, could we
Do
see
you
the
have
next?
anything to add to that, Elizabeth?
No, I think, but I think indeed it's interesting that at first I would also automatically click on above ground carbon storage because it seems so logical because they eat it. But indeed, then we got, as scientists, you get arguing about how this would exactly work. And then if you think it's this longer term, indeed, you may think if it's either the herbivores eat it or it will burn, then the net effect on carbon storage is sort of the same. So I guess both could be true.
Thank you both. Interesting. So still many things more to be found out also in that topic. I think we have the second question. So please put in your answers for this question. How do you think large wildlife will affect climate change mitigation or adaptation when we actually have predators, when predators are present? Seems to be a bit more of a difficult question because where we in the first one we saw clear clicks to 1, we're having a bit of a more balanced outcome where many people are still saying we don't know yet. We do see a bit of a split in the other way around. Liesbeth and Nacho, how we have a bit of a picture that's, well, it's turning a bit to we don't know yet, and the rest it's a bit balanced. What do you think in this context?
Yeah, I personally clicked on we don't know yet. But yeah, you could argue, of course, based on the concept of what we call a trophic cascade, meaning that if predators eat herbivores, then the vegetation is released from grazing. So therefore, the famous Yellowstone example that wolves can actually affect the amount of trees while they do not eat trees themselves, but it's because of the effect they have on the herbivores. And then you would think, yeah, if the predators reduce the impact of the herbivores, you would come up with more carbon storage in the end, I would think. On the other hand, this is a bit of a static or simple way of reasoning, because if it's in a whole landscape context, there will be all sorts of effects of predators, not just directly by eating or affecting the herbivores immediately at a certain location, but it will vary a lot. And then I think we don't have too many examples yet, so that's why I think there's definitely room for research.
And the final question we would like to ask you for now, before we move to the Q&A, which is on here right now, and this isn't a multiple choice. We are actually asking you if you could provide some input yourself, and we really want to know from what aspects the role of large wildlife can play. So the topic we've been discussing today, would you be interested in learning more about, or what are some of the research gaps that you see yourself after hearing this? So some of this, everything we've talked about, what was most interesting to you? What are you interested to learn more about? Or what do you see as research gaps yourself? We're very curious to hear this. So we're already seeing some things coming up here in Nacho and Liesbeth, some of the points that some of the points you mentioned yourself, right? This balance, when are the effects negative or not negative, to know more about that. Aquatic ecosystems and some others too. There's also some components about something that you might not have thought about at all. The use of biotechnology in this concept, or social perceptions to wildlife and large herbivores. Is there something you are thinking about that in that as well?
Yeah, I first saw the soil topic coming up. I think that's very important. We know still relatively little what's going on in the soil. And you see that often people are calculating in models, and so what is above ground carbon, because you can count trees and make some calculations. But actually, if you want long-term sequestration of carbon, it needs to be in the soil. So it's really a black box to look under the ground, so to say. So that's a good point. And for me, I'm also an aquatic ecologist. I would always tend to say wetlands are also very important in this as well. So they are often slightly overlooked, I would say, as also great topic in this. Nacho, can you add some points?
Yes, for sure. There's this, I mean, linked to the last subject that you mentioned. There's also this movement to start to look at the landscape as well, and not just simple ecosystems, but also linkages between ecosystems, so between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. There's a few comments as well on the sort of more social aspects of research, and that's something we are addressing in our Wildly project as well. So we have a number of case studies across Europe, and we're not looking at only at the ecological effects of rewilding, but also at the social perspectives and economical perspectives and the policies that are in different regions of Europe, and how people perceive rewilding in different places in Europe, and how the policy is set up or not to cope with rewilding. So that's another aspect that is being studied, and that is very interesting if people want to make rewilding a success.
Super. I think there's loads of interesting things there, but I do also want to make sure that we have a bit of time to answer some of the questions that have been put in. So I would like to close this Mentimeter and actually go to some of the questions. And the first one that came up in the chat, Nacho, you alluded to it already at the start, but could you elaborate a bit more on the potential and the need of these livestock surrogates? You said it's something that's being developed still, as in research, ongoing research, but could you elaborate a bit more? What would the role be of livestock instead of wild animals to fulfill some of the functions that you've described today?
Yeah, well, so for many decades we've been researching. Actually, there's been lots of research in using large cattle livestock as surrogate of large wild species, and yeah, they have an influence on and they can replicate some of the process, but at some extent. I mean, the thing is that, you know, one or two or three species of livestock cannot possibly, you know, replicate the functional role of the diversity of species that we should be seeing out there. And I'm not talking about coming back to the Pleistocene. I'm talking about with the species that we already have. We could have much more diversity of species of large wildlife out there, and we could, and therefore the process that they bring, the complementary between different species would you know, facilitate to replicate other processes that have been lost. And so livestock can at some extent replicate the effect of wildlife, but large wildlife cannot substitute it. And another point is that livestock is usually, you know, managed in a way that that is heavily intensively managed. So there are high densities usually. So you know, it's not so using one or two species at very high densities on an ecosystem is not the solution to bring back to life the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I would add what is interesting, I think, is that we can learn from these wild animal communities and the conditions under which they may have positive effects. Like Nacho says, maybe it is the diversity and the complementarity, but you could, of course, also apply that to more extensive or sort of wilder ways of farming, so to say. So it could actually be a gradient that you can learn from that and implement it in some way as well.
Super interesting. Much more potential there possibly than we actually think about often. There are some other questions here as well. Some of them are a bit more related to, one is related to the beavers, whereas the question is, do beavers increase water storage as well by increasing the space of the bed of the rivers? That's one part. And they also had a second question. In the presentation, you mentioned that cattle reduce the carbon storage in the soil. Could you elaborate on both questions a bit as well? I think it could be relatively short answers.
I could say something about beavers, if that's okay.
Yeah, probably they are more qualified.
Yeah, so for sure, beavers enhance the water storage capacity because, well, with the damming, they create sort of a wetland type of situation. And that often means that previously it wasn't very much of a wetland, so the water was draining much faster than if you come in this wetland situation with also the wetland plants. That will store or be able to do water retention to a much larger extent than before there was this beaver activity.
Yeah, concerning the livestock, I'm not the first author of this study of the. I think the question was referring to the savannas, of this negative role of cattle in the savannas on soil carbon. But yeah, I mean the large ungulate, large herbivores and super large megafauna, what we call megafauna in savannas, they redirect the carbon to the soil, if you want. So, and then they also stimulate the productivity of the grasses in savannas, and they also allow them or stimulate the development of roots and exudates and other things that happen in the soil ecosystem, if you want. So they promote the accumulation of carbon in the soil, okay, by sort of expanding, if you want, or nurturing the soil ecosystem. And obviously, if you have cattle instead of large super large herbivores, then you don't have the same, magnitude of stimulation, if you want. So yeah, that's one of the pathways that I think applies to the system, and probably there are some others, because large herbivores not only affect soil carbon through one pathway, but many others. There's a lot of people studying at the moment, for example, how they affect microbial communities in soil.
Thank you, Nacho. So for the full details, read the paper, but this is some ways it might happen. I have another question here, and it's what is the progress on actually having an estimate of the potential carbon sequestration contribution from a largely rewilded Europe in general? So in other words, what is your current perception of what can be the contribution of rewilding to meeting the climate targets in the EU?
Yeah, that's great question. I hope we can answer it with this Wild E project, to be honest. So I think there isn't a ready-made number right now. One of the things, but I think you could do the calculations for sure, but I don't have a number directly. I think there's huge potential, but I would say then we need to consider different forms of rewilding, because we talk now today the topic is about the role of large wildlife, which is one aspect of rewilding. But rewilding is all about bringing back natural processes. So that could be the role of these animals, but it could also be the role of water, or related to hydrology and re-wetting of landscapes, for instance. And also stopping to cut forests, so you get land abandonment type of situations, abandoning agricultural use. So there's many ways of rewilding you can think of, and one of the things we really would love to know is how these different ways of rewilding actually contribute to these targets, and can you then make smart combinations so that you can both stimulate carbon sequestration, for instance, combined with adaptation to climate change, combined with biodiversity wins. That would be the holy grail, so to speak. So it's important to try to take these all into account, but it's a great start to do some calculations there. Yeah, nice question.
So I think that is something that ties in nicely with the conclusion of this. It is stay tuned for many more of our webinars in Wild E, and hopefully throughout this webinar series, somewhere at some point, we can actually answer this question in detail at the end of this project and journey. For us, as we have to close off at 11, I'm sorry for those questions that might not be answered, but we do have to close. So I want to thank you all for being present today. Thank you, Liesbeth and Nacho, for joining us and kicking off this section. If you want to know more about Wild E, and if you want to learn more, follow our channels, sign up to our newsletter, which you can do through the website, and do join us for our future webinars. With all of this, thank you so much for being here, and see you next time.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Looking forward for the next seminars.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.